Mason Dalton was the kind of teenager every parent thought they wanted. Quiet, intelligent, and always home by curfew. Edward Dalton, his proud father and a respected history teacher, believed he had raised a thoughtful young man. But when Mason walked into a police station and calmly confessed to a crime so disturbing it left an entire town in disbelief, Edward's world shattered in an instant. What could drive a seemingly normal boy to commit an unthinkable act, and how had no one seen it coming? The Dalton family had always been considered one of the most respected in Oak Ridge, a quiet town nestled deep in the Oregon countryside. Edward Dalton, a high school history teacher for over 20 years, was known for his structured lifestyle, dedication to education, and unwavering principles. He was the kind of man who believed in order, discipline, and hard work. His wife, Helen, was warm-hearted and soft-spoken, running a successful home bakery that drew customers from all around the neighborhood. They lived in a modest but charming two-story house at the edge of town, surrounded by trees and the calm hum of rural life. Their son, Mason Dalton, was 17 years old and in his final year of high school. He wasn't particularly outgoing, but no one found that strange. Mason was quiet, thoughtful, and often spent hours alone in his room painting or reading. Teachers praised his intelligence, and though he didn't have many close friends, he was never in trouble. Edward saw Mason's quiet nature as a sign of maturity, and Helen often called him her little genius. To the outside world, they were a picture-perfect family, stable, loving, and without any visible cracks. But behind closed doors, things were changing. Mason had begun to withdraw more and more. He stopped helping with chores, stopped answering when his parents asked him questions, and began skipping classes without explanation. At first, Helen brushed it off, thinking it was just part of being a teenager. She told Edward that Mason was just going through a phase and needed space. Edward wasn't convinced. He believed in accountability, and he began leaving handwritten notes on Mason's door reminding him about his responsibilities. Mason never responded. Then came the locked doors. Mason started keeping his bedroom locked, even when he wasn't home. He claimed it was because he didn't want his paintings disturbed. Helen accepted the explanation. Edward didn't like it, but he let it go. After all, Mason had never been violent, never raised his voice, never showed signs of rebellion. Just distance. That distance continued to grow until the family dinners turned into silent affairs. Mason would sit, barely eating, eyes fixed on the table, then excuse himself and disappear for the night. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came one cold evening in February 2025. Edward returned home after an after-school meeting to find their street blocked by flashing lights. Police cars were parked in front of their house, and yellow tape had already gone up across the porch. Helen stood on the sidewalk, arms wrapped around herself, unable to speak. Edward pushed through the small crowd of neighbors and approached the house. That's when he saw Mason, sitting on the porch steps, hands resting on his knees, face pale and blank. He wasn't crying. He wasn't saying a word. Inside the house, detectives were moving through the hallway, opening drawers, bagging items, and examining Mason's room. Edward was told to stay back, but he caught a glimpse inside. The room was cluttered with stacks of sketchbooks, some filled with drawings that didn't look like art. They looked like nightmares. Officers had found something that led them there, but no one was saying exactly what. Mason had turned himself in. According to what little the police would say at the time, he had walked into the local precinct that afternoon and calmly told them he had information about a missing girl. A girl no one in Oak Ridge had seen for months. That's when everything shifted. The perfect image of the Dalton family began to collapse, piece by piece, in front of the entire town. And Edward Dalton, a man who had spent his life teaching young people to think clearly and act wisely, was about to learn that he never really knew his own son. The journal was the first major clue. bound in worn brown leather and hidden beneath a loose floorboard under Mason's bed. It didn't look like much at first glance. But as investigators flipped through its pages, a darker picture began to emerge. Unlike an ordinary diary, it wasn't filled with day-to-day reflections or school memories. Instead, it contained an unsettling mix of detailed sketches, disjointed thoughts, and strange coded phrases. Some pages were covered in quick, anxious scribbles, others in precise, almost clinical handwriting. What truly alarmed the detectives were the dates, each one lining up eerily with the timeline of Lily Brent's disappearance. Lily Brent had gone missing 6 months earlier from a neighboring town just a 30-minute drive from Oak Ridge. She was only 14, last seen walking home from her after-school art class. A missing persons report had been filed, posters had been put up, and search teams had combed the area for weeks. But there had been no trace of her. Eventually, the case went cold, and her family was left without answers. Until now. Inside the journal were references to a project. Mason had written about testing limits, controlling environments, and removing outside distractions. One entry read, "Silence is the only way to understand real fear. Her silence is teaching me everything." Another page had a chilling line that simply said, "She cried the first night, but then it got quiet." The words alone weren't definitive proof, but they pointed clearly towards someone deeply disturbed and possibly involved in something criminal. Investigators immediately began connecting the dots. Mason's internet history, though partially deleted, revealed visits to dark psychology forums and private chat rooms. He had downloaded articles on behavioral control, isolation tactics, and survival conditions. One search had asked, "How long can someone survive in cold without food?" Others were about sedatives, hiding evidence, and cleaning human scent trails. The officers pieced together a disturbing narrative that Mason had not only researched how to abduct and contain someone, but had also acted on those plans. Faced with the growing pile of evidence, the police confronted Mason again. This time, he didn't resist. In the same detached tone he had used at the station, he told them everything. He confessed to luring Lily with a fake online art contest, offering a chance to feature her work in a youth talent showcase. He'd created a fake website, sent her an email under a false name, and arranged to meet her at a bus stop. From Ew. There, he took her to an old cabin deep in the woods, land owned by the Dalton family but long forgotten, inherited from Edward's uncle years ago, and left to decay. What followed was hard for investigators to listen to. Mason described his actions without emotion, as if recalling a science project. He said he kept Lily locked inside, bringing her food, watching how she reacted to light, silence, and isolation. He wrote notes about her behavior, her tears, and eventually, her silence. When asked why he did it, Mason simply said, "I wanted to see what happens when a person has nothing. No time, no sound, no escape. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was curiosity." Forensic teams were dispatched immediately to the cabin. What they found confirmed Mason's story. The structure was partially collapsed, hidden by thick trees, unreachable by car. Inside, there were clear signs of habitation. Old, blankets, empty food cans, and a section of the floor that had been heavily disturbed. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic and covered in timber, they found Lily's remains. DNA tests confirmed the identity. Items in the cabin, bits of fabric, strands of hair, and even fingerprints, linked back to Mason. The horror became undeniable. This was not a boy who had made a mistake. This was someone who had methodically planned and carried out an act so inhumane that even the most experienced officers on the case were left shaken. Edward and Helen Dalton were notified of the findings. Edward refused to speak. Helen collapsed when the truth was shared. The town of Oak Ridge, still struggling to understand what had happened, now faced the reality that a child from their own community had become the architect of something unimaginably dark. The courtroom was silent as Mason Dalton was led in, his wrists bound, his expression blank. The boy who had once been considered a quiet, intelligent teenager now stood accused of one of the most horrifying crimes in the region's recent history. Reporters packed the benches, and local residents who had once waved to the Daltons at the grocery store now watched in stunned disbelief. What began as a missing persons case had turned into a chilling study of control, manipulation, and emotional emptiness. The prosecution presented their evidence in chilling detail. Mason's journal, his internet history, and the physical evidence from the cabin all painted a clear picture. He had stalked his victim online, deceived her with false promises, and taken her to a place designed for complete isolation. What shocked the courtroom the most wasn't just the brutality of the act, it was the methodical planning. This wasn't impulsive. This was orchestrated. Experts were called in to examine Mason's mental state. Psychologists described him as emotionally disconnected, possibly exhibiting traits of antisocial personality disorder. They noted his lack of empathy, his calculated demeanor, and his disturbing obsession with control. He had referred to Lily as a variable in his notes, as if she were part of an experiment rather than a living, breathing person. While he understood the legal and moral implications of his actions, he showed no remorse. It was not about hatred, they said. It was about power, about what it meant to hold someone's entire world in the palm of his hand. The defense struggled to find any ground. They argued that Mason had shown signs of isolation and mental instability for years, that his quiet nature was a mask for unresolved emotional trauma. But nothing could excuse the deliberate nature of his actions. The jury watched video footage of the cabin site, listened to testimony from forensic analysts, and reviewed the contents of the journal page by page. Each entry drew a deeper gasp from the audience. Each piece of evidence further removed any image of the harmless boy Mason had once appeared to be. Edward Dalton attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row, barely moving. He refused interviews, never responded to questions, and kept his gaze fixed forward. Those who saw him described him as a man shattered, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow, a person watching the ground fall from beneath his feet. Helen stopped, coming after the first week. She had reportedly been hospitalized for severe emotional distress, unable to reconcile the son she raised with the monster described in court. On the final day, the courtroom held its breath as the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and second-degree murder. Mason Dalton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remained expressionless as the sentence was read. He neither looked at the judge, nor at his father, nor at anyone in the room. It was as if he was already somewhere else, mentally detached from the world around him. The town of Oak Ridge was never the same. The Dalton home was sold quietly. The new owners repainted the walls and cleared out everything that had once belonged to the family. Edward and Helen moved away, leaving no forwarding address. The school where Edward had once taught replaced his name on the staff list without ceremony. No one spoke of Mason unless they had to. His name became a shadow, a reminder of how little people sometimes know about those closest to them. The case would be remembered not just for its horror, but for the unsettling realization it left behind. Evil doesn't always announce itself. It can live in silence, tucked away in bedrooms behind locked doors, dressed in good grades and polite smiles. Mason Dalton didn't look like a monster, but beneath the surface, something terrifying had been quietly growing until it was too late to stop.